Hello, friends. I'm so delighted to have as my guest on this Shakti dialogue, Santosh Desai, a very prolific social commentator, and he runs a popular column in the Times of India called City City Bang Bang. And the reason I reached out to him today is because of this post of 25th April, Monday, 2022. This was the Mumbai edition, and it's titled "Of Jokes, Veg and Non-Veg." So welcome, Santosh. First of all, a very big thanks for saying yes to the Shakti Dialogue.
My pleasure entirely, Nilima. Thank you so much for having me on this podcast.
And we were just discussing the only way we can have a conversation on the post is if one of us reads it out first for our listener. So what do you think? Who should be reading it?
No, I think it would be nice if you read it out. It would be interesting to hear those words coming from somebody else's kind of mouth and perspective. So why don't you read it out?
Okay, so here goes. Of Jokes, Veg and Non-Veg by Santosh Desai. A familiar part of the party in the 80s was the joke-telling session. Some gifted raconteur would start the process and one joke would follow another. At some stage in the session, gears would shift. The first salvo would be fired after an embarrassing introduction of "Ye thoda non-veg hai, chalega?" The ladies were expected to react with coy anticipation and the men with enthusiastic approval. One non-veg joke would follow another, much to the delight of most of the gathering. The idea of anything being thoda non-veg apart, the risky joke became a sight of adult knowingness. I've underlined these pieces, okay, where the deep thinker that Santosh Desai comes through. The jokes themselves were usually not very funny. It seemed that any invocation of the forbidden subject was by itself enough to evoke suppressed giggles from those present. I still remember the thrill of adult excitement that coursed through me as an 11-year-old when I heard my first non-veg joke. Narrated to me by an older friend who studied at a boarding school and was thus privy to a vast set of adult information that I was innocent of. It involved a comely woman and a lady's bicycle. The details are unimportant, but I do remember that it began a chapter in my education, which other such jokes helped cement into a knowledge of the most unreliable kind. I thought that was funny. The introduction to Messrs. Bird and Bee, one joke at a time, with anything that referred to the act of sex having an air of presumed comedy, was the way a large part of India acquired knowledge of matters sexual. I underlined that as well. The non-veg joke was another small safety valve that helped us navigate an otherwise restrained attitude towards pleasure by opening a tightly barricaded door ever so slightly just for a while. It acknowledged desire, albeit in a roundabout way, and allowed for the legitimization of an impulse that otherwise was off limits. The cultural hesitancy to talk about sex openly created new pathways for the subject to get represented. In many ways, the non-veg joke was more innocent in its tentative handling of sexual desire than the ugly and distorted manner in which it was often dealt with in cinema. This I found very important. The use of the exploitative rape scene, the manner in which the camera assaulted the female, the innuendo-laden dialogue that imagined sex as a form of plunder. These were the staples in cinema, particularly in the 80s. The characterization of a bawdy joke as being non-veg says something both about an attitude towards sex as it does towards non-vegetarianism, both acts of flesh. Now, this I think is the single biggest insight in this entire article. It is also a sign of how non-vegetarian food is regarded in large parts of India, less as food and more as a form of forbidden pleasure. The meat versus vegetable fault line is not particularly to India, but the basis of the tension does vary. In India, there is something implicitly righteous about vegetarian food, while eating non-veg food is seen by many communities as an act of transgression. I underline that. It is interesting, particularly in the light of the current aversion to all things non-vegetarian that is on display today, how the idea of non-veg elicited a reaction far more complex than mere aversion. People give up non-vegetarian food as an act of sacrifice or penance, akin to an act of chastity. A day of the week or a festival, a stage in life, these become triggers to give up something seen as extremely pleasurable. In that sense, the term non-veg is far more appropriate label than the dirty joke. The idea of the non-vegetarian locates it very much within the realms of everyday social practice while acknowledging its taboo character. I love how you're finding that, holding that tension, and allowing for this deeper thing. So if the non-veg joke is not as much a part of our social vocabulary today, it has a lot to do with the fact that the institution of joke telling in a social setting seems to have lost its former glory. It has either been atomized into many different forms and become a part of our everyday digital experience, or been professionalized in the form of stand-up comics who make their livelihood out of telling jokes. Very important point now. As a result, the "have you heard this one" opening line that preceded such sessions is a rarity now. The personal anecdote is much more in vogue today. Telling a funny story about a personal experience is preferred over a packaged joke. It is part of the pressure to be more interesting. Being naturally funny is seen as being more important than using secondhand jokes as a crutch. Wow. Besides, most jokes traditionally worked on the basis of an implicit social consensus around stereotypes. The talkative woman, the nagging wife, the poor put-upon husband, racial and regional stereotypes, the omnipresent Santa Banta jokes were the staples of the jokes that we have grown up on. The social purpose of the joke was to bring the community of listeners together by reinforcing existing beliefs and cementing them by creating a common target that could be made fun of. Another big insight. Understandably, in today's hyper-vigilant environment, the idea of jokes that perpetuate these kinds of stereotypes falls outside the pale of accepted social behavior. Making jokes based on race, physical features, and disabilities are recognized as being cruel. In this context, the non-veg joke tends to be more subversive, in that it features subjects and behaviors at odds with common stereotypes. In these jokes, women can feel desire. They can even cheat. Respected figures can display a baseness of impulse. People can fart in public. The usual sanskari codes do not apply. While this is not true of all jokes of this kind, by its very nature, the non-veg joke works because it creates unease with what is seen as conventional stereotypical behavior. And I love how you end it. It gives our repressed desires a dotted line existence. They may be tabled, but do not need to be taken seriously. That is the biggest power of the joke. We can claim that we were only joking. Wow. How did you feel hearing your own words?
I felt, it was interesting because I think, what it does is that also I think in the kind of emphasis that you put on certain ideas and what you underline, I think in a sense while of course those are words that are familiar since I wrote them, but I think there is a certain freshness to these, which when I see it through your eyes. So I think that is really interesting.
So this thing of we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are.
We are.
And even in line. So I guess you heard it through me. So let me ask the question: how do you get your inspiration for your column? And second part of the same question is, what was the inspiration for this column?
So, because a lot of my columns actually come from aspects of everyday life, I think typically the inspiration either comes by, acts of reminiscing, or, when you look back upon your own life and, it's like, so it's almost revisiting parts of your life and then suddenly favoring one aspect of it with a little more meaning than you otherwise would have. So like you may remember that, listening to music, I remember, there was an uncle and he used to have this gramophone and he was super possessive about it, and how, the whole fetishizing of the act. And then you say, okay, actually, that was true for all appliances. We used to have gadgets like that. And the gadget was this installation and everybody had to be respectful. But, you didn't own too much. So whatever you owned had to be treated reverentially. So that suddenly then, because, I have a column to write, what would otherwise have been an ordinary act of memory now becomes a sort of a source for a next piece, saying, okay, I think that's there's a piece in it, somewhere. So typically it comes from just everyday sort of thoughts, or it might be a topical subject. Something comes up, and you kind of, because it is in vogue, that subject is in vogue. And so, for instance, vegetarian, non-vegetarian, for instance, in this particular case, since there is so much talk about the fact that in Navratri, that vegetarian, non-vegetarian food is banned and selling it is banned. And there is so much conversation around it. I think so that the subject became a little more salient. And so it became a trigger. And yes, the controversy itself is interesting. And I have probably written about it at some stage. But I think the other aspect of it, which is not the political dimension of the vegetarian, non-vegetarian debate, but what it triggered was the idea of the idea of the non-veg joke, saying that, which is such a peculiar kind of a way in which it's an Indianism, the non-veg joke. I mean, I don't think in other parts of the world, jokes are vegetarian or non-vegetarian. They can be dirty or they can be the regular joke. So it just kind of triggered the thought. So in this case, in a sense, it was triggered by something, topical, but it kind of then went in a slightly different direction.
It's so interesting. I thought it was the other way around. I thought you started thinking about non-veg jokes and then you connected it to non-vegetarianism.
Right.
But you're telling me it's the opposite, that it was the whole dialogue about being vegetarian or non-vegetarian at this time.
Yes.
Then made you think about humor.
Yes, it was the other way around. In this case, it was the other way around. Yes.
And I think you inadvertently touched a far deeper topic. Right?
Yeah. No, but that's the interesting thing is, because in a sense, I think what is interesting in terms of just thinking about stuff is actually the other meaning or the other set of meanings that can flow from what is otherwise topical and commonplace. I always find that more interesting. I find the other side of it rather than because that the current subject is discussed to death, and there are lots of views on it already that are on the table, and the dimension of it are known. They're in the public domain. They reveal themselves easily. The dimensions, however, when you look at the other side and the other set of meanings that can flow from anything current, I think, or the underlying pattern that informs that debate. So for instance, the idea of I remember writing about the fact that this is some time back where Valentine's Day was being re-Christianed by some people as, respect your parents' day or something like that, and to me, the idea of trying to take romance, of the young and trying to sort of confirm, I mean, sort of transfigure it in some form as respect for authority and parental authority. It just seemed like a much more interesting take on the Valentine's Day controversy than Valentine's Day and the subject around it. You know, the fact that, so it's a question of I think using something current, but finding maybe an underlying pattern or some other dimension of it, which may not be most apparent at first glance. But to examine that in greater detail, I just find that a more interesting starting point.
So before we go deeper into this particular subject, just for our listeners, you know, how did you become a social commentator? I mean, I know you were in advertising and you were in strategic planning, so you had a mind of a deeper thinker. So, you know, where did this ability to look to, you know, behind social behaviors, where did that come from?
Yeah, that label social commentator is not my description. I mean, but in a way, I think it is. I'm okay with it simply because I think it is appropriately modest, because it doesn't say, because I'm not a sociologist and I'm not so it's a commentary on society, which I think is a fair description, you know, of the kind of writing I do. But I think it came about because I think I joined, you know, around that I joined advertising in the mid 80s. I joined advertising in 1986, in fact, and which was just around the time that economic reforms had started. The first set of reforms started in 85 and then 1991. So by the time which was the time that a lot of new businesses and a lot of multinationals were coming to India. And the question for advertising, particularly, it was at that time, we were kind of cultural interpreters, two-way interpreters. We had to interpret India for this new set of people who were coming and interpret their brands for India. So, I mean, in a sense, willy-nilly, we were playing a role which was much larger than just figuring out, you know, what to do in our advertising. And it kind of opened a door for me. It increasingly, most marketing problems started appearing cultural in nature. I mean, they fundamentally were about understanding the culture and connecting with some part of that culture. And because the early multinationals kind of fumbled and stumbled a lot in this regard, you know, because they came with a presumed, you know, arrogance in a sense of having done this in 100 other countries, and then found that, you know, India was much tougher going than what they had anticipated. So they were eager to understand what was really happening. And the truth is that, you know, as Indians, I mean, we might at one level say we are Indians, we understand India, but that's not true. Because in fact, most of us come from privileged backgrounds relative to, you know, even if we think of ourselves as coming from, you know, difficult middle-class backgrounds, the truth is anybody in India who thinks that they are middle class are actually privileged. I mean, our understanding of you know, of arithmetic in that sense as to what the middleness means is fundamentally flawed, because we are all on the privileged side, and our understanding of India actually is quite primitive and it's quite basic. And so therefore that became almost like a lifelong exercise in understanding and cross-connecting various pieces about India, trying to make sense of why we behaved the way we do. And so therefore everything, you know, so over the last, let's say, almost 35 years, that has been part of an, you know, and it's one of those things that is impossible to get to the bottom of. India is impossible in a sense to fully grasp, and I think it's a conceit to believe you can. But I think the quest was important, and therefore I think that's how this whole idea of social commentary, because by not thinking of marketing in limited terms and saying marketing is culture, and therefore, and the other is the ambition to say that if you want to understand India, you have to understand all of it. You can't understand part of it. All of it.
Yes.
So, you know, it's one thing. So if I'm working in, say, a beauty product, it is not enough to understand beauty and women. You have to understand identity, you have to understand caste, you cannot understand India one piece at a time. You have to understand all of it, which is a hell of a task. But you need that ambit, you need that scope, if you have to be honest about trying to understand India. And so once that became the lens, I think it just helped, you know, the fact that one was adding to on a sort of, so virtually on a, you know, year by year basis, one was trying to understand and build a perspective on how things tie together. As it turned out, you know, just through random accident, I got an opportunity to write. And in fact, when I started this column, it was meant to be a for a few months. And the name City City Bang Bang came because I was supposed to write about life in the city. But it just took on a life of its own. And it's now 17 years. So, I mean, so it's just became one of those things that, they forgot to say stop now. So, I continue.
And do you think something that's 17 years old has now taken on a life of its own?
Yes, I think in many ways it has now a momentum of its own, although, it does have, after 17 years, finding subjects to write about is not easy because, one has written about a lot of things already. And a weekly column, is therefore can become a little taxing. But yeah, it has become now, it's now a muscle that I think one has developed. And so there is a certain kind of flow that comes naturally. There is a certain ease, I think, that does develop after a point in time.
So coming to this particular one, right, of jokes, veg and non-veg, I can't help but feel you've kind of perhaps unpeeled the layer to the next, the next stage of insight. Because there are so many levels at which one can find insight and comment on. You've touched something very archetypal in this column. So let me connect this to Shakti leadership, right? So one of the things in Shakti leadership, embracing feminine and masculine power in leadership, it's drawn from depth psychology. It's drawn from archetypal psychology, saying that where does our power come from? What are we driven by? And we know both in the Western Jungian tradition and in the Buddhic, Indic tradition, the concept of Kama, Mara, Maya, Vidya, right? That man thinks he's a civilized creature, but scratch the surface and underneath he's an animal, right? She is an animal, right? So eros, that life drive, which is our sexual instincts, that id, and then its complementary other side. In fact, they're two faces of the same force. Is thanatos, which is the death drive, to be aggressive for survival, to kill or be killed. And it is this powerful drive of our vital nature that's hardwired into us and needed for our survival and our procreation. We haven't yet mastered these drives as a species, which is why every day the rape stories, not just rape, but violence in that, the killing and the grotesque, just so much of that. And that's one reason the book came out, Shakti Leadership, saying, what is it that's going on in the human psyche? And what is the way to, maturing as a species? And how do we ever come in control of these drives? Because not having them isn't an option. It will die, And at the same time, when it expresses through us, if it expresses in its raw animal nature, it's not okay in civilized society, right? Just because you're aroused by a female, you can't just go and have her, right? Just because you get really angry at someone, you want to fight, you're capable of killing, doesn't mean you should kill that person, right? So what are we to do with this animal nature? So societies have traditionally, and this comes from tribes and so on, figured out the safety valve that you talk about, right? Which is how to find contained ways where you allow that instinct and that drive to get expressed in a safe way. So Mardi Gras, right? Or Halloween or Holi, right?
Holi, yeah.
Holi in India.
Absolutely.
And suddenly you kind of make it socially okay, but just for that amount of time. And you do set some boundaries, even in how that is expressed. And so in Shakti work, we've often said the best way to hone and express eros in a healthy way is through art. And to hone and express thanatos instead of going to war is sport. You work out your competitive nature. And of course, the third piece, which you have touched upon, is humor, right? So we talk about becoming the wise fool of tough love. These are the 4 drives that become conscious in you. that fool archetype. We all get wise, we all know how to love, and we all know how to be tough. But many of us have lost touch with the fool in us. And so what you're talking about here is, in a social setting, getting into this kind of joke telling and calling it non-veg and not, because the minute it's dirty, then it gets down into porn and depravity. So how do you express this in a way that is still sweet and acceptable and safe? So what you said in the end, right, that it gives our repressed desires a dotted line existence, meaning it's that sweet spot. It's not a full line.
Yeah.
And it's not a line. It's a dotted line, right? So they can be tabled, but do not need to be taken seriously. So I think you just put your finger on something so important here for Indians to look at themselves with this new lens, that what they have been doing as unconscious competence, which is dealing with this desire, in such an innocent, sweet, just the right amount kind of way. What you have done with this blog is made it more conscious, made this competence more conscious. And I guess my invitation to the listeners is, hey, here's yet another elixir from the Indic way of life that maybe can be shared with the rest of the world, so they don't have to suffer from, just the craziness these drives otherwise create. So do you want to speak to that in some way?
No, I think that's true, and that's so true. I think the fact that the safety valves that we have, and I think humor is actually a safety valve in a much larger sense. Although this is a non-veg joke, so I think which touches upon matters to do with desire, pleasure, the sexual instinct. But even I think a lot of the other jokes, the idea that the Freudian idea that the joke is fundamentally cruel in some form or the other, and it becomes an outlet. So therefore, it's not just eros; it's also thanatos. I mean, in some senses, because what you are doing with the idea of the frailties, the vulnerabilities, which are otherwise. So today, when we take the joke, see what happens when we today, in fact, the proscription against jokes of a certain kind is when we mix two codes, when we mix the symbolic with the literal. A literal reading of the joke, when becomes, therefore, then it becomes impossible to see it as a joke. But the joke does not exist in the literal sphere. It exists in a symbolic sphere, right? So because the idea of the woman or the idea, they're standing in for, like you said, an archetypal. They have an archetypal presence. They don't have a literal presence. And I think so. Part of the loss of some of those safety valves happen when you start reading the symbolic in a literal sense. And I think that is one of the issues of today's times, that you read it literally. So the idea of if you're characterizing, and to some extent, I think that is inevitable. So it's not as if that is not inevitable. So when you have a racial stereotype, for instance, it is difficult not to read it literally, because it's application. So it's like the fact that the Santa Manta joke, at one level, there was a time when like a Kushwant Singh loved telling Sardarji jokes. There was a time but there was also equally there was a recognition the fact that it did result in a certain amount of a literal reading, where young kids in school would be bullied. I think this interaction between the symbolic and the literal, I think, is what I think has the decline of the joke. In some senses, the non-veg joke in particular, I think there is a loss there. The other thing that occurs to me when you are talking about the Indic way and in dealing with subjects of this kind, which is not exactly humor, but the idea, say, of the kind of body music that accompanies weddings, which is performed by women, right? Which is the other interesting kind of a safety valve that we have, which is actually quite at odds with the culture otherwise. The fact that a bunch of women get together and actually perform, not merely sing, but also perform in a way that is totally out of character with anything else that they do, with anything else that they have been sort of trained to do. All the values that they have apparently been have been inculcated in them, all of them they behave in a way that is absolutely contrary to all of that in a closed, safe space. But the excessive kind of a almost fetishizing of the first sort of the night of the marriage, and if you look at the whole, the rituals that surround it, I think is again a very interesting kind of a dimension that has been culturally created to create this kind of a space. So you talk about Holi, which in some senses you see aspects of that again there, where again it's a kind of a safety valve that you have created this little space where it is possible for women and men to kind of for there to be an outlet to that desire. In again a very tightly circumscribed space in terms of time. You can do that for half a day.
Yes.
You can have bhang then. You can have, it's interesting how we allow for that. We allow for that kind of intoxication, that total loss of self and self-control that you are permitting at that time. I think it's incredible that there is that understanding of being able to create these little outlets, which you could argue the other way also, because those are the mechanisms that allow for a certain amount of social order to be maintained. So in that sense, depending on how you see it, they become vital instruments in actually creating social continuity and order.
That's precisely the point, that if we repress these drives, they will come out in an unconscious and shadow way. They will be terrible. They will break down society. So Indic society has figured out a way to let it be expressed in a safe way, right? So it's so important, because now that it gets expressed through all these little ways that are embedded into the annual culture calendar, the society can stay sane.
Absolutely.
Wow. So the thing we add to in the fourfold self is that in addition to eros, thanatos that belong to the soma, the body, the mind has two drives called logos and mythos.
Right.
The logos is our rational self and mythos is our imaginative self. And, in a way, the only way to be able to balance eros and thanatos is to bring in logos and mythos as well. And they all four kind of stabilize each other, right? From a place of presence, so to speak. So,
but I think the thing is, using this framework, I would say that when mythos gets interpreted in terms of logos, instead of that tension and the balance being maintained, is when you start interpreting it literally. Because when you apply a rational filter, an overly rational filter to something that is intrinsically mythical.
Yes, love it. Absolutely. So again, the invitation that just as we have built the logos muscle and we're very good at our rational selves, we also need to learn how to be symbolic and, just allow for that sort of mythic freedom. Because if that doesn't find expression, then it just becomes two-dimensional and we lose the plot, right? So, I just find Indic culture over hundreds and thousands of unbroken, just being there for so long has just worked out all these things so naturally, so beautifully, to the point that it's come to unconscious competence. We don't even know we have it, right? And it's when you write things like this that we kind of make it visible to ourselves and realize, oops, let's make sure we're keeping these carefully going, because if we lose them in some way, the fabric of what keeps this culture going will tear. So thank you. Any last comment on where you are with this theme right now, and maybe even out of this conversation?
No, I think what the point you make about the fact that this is a culture that because over time the desire to maintain social continuity has necessarily meant that you understand both what to control and what to let go. Both become very important parts of the design, and I think this is an intricately designed culture. There's no one designer, but over time through the participation, I think, of so many kind of, centuries of this kind of a culture of learning how to kind of maintain itself. I think the push and pull and the fact that there is enough elasticity within it to accommodate change, to accommodate impulse, and yet maintain a certain sort of a flow and an inherent continuity. I think that is really what this does best, and which is the reason why I think there is a certain the fact that in India, I've always argued that modernity in India is nothing but negotiated tradition. It is always the fact that the past expands its way and makes way for the present, without there being a surrender to the present. So the forces of today and yesterday, the attempt is for the culture to reconcile the two and find a place for the new within the old, and to see the new as a version of the old, rather than as an antithesis of the old. And therefore, you find in many ways this kind of a continuity. Say, for instance, very easy example for that is the way marriage has evolved in India. So you have what we call the love marriage and what we had the arranged marriage as antithesis. You could think of them as completely founded on two completely different starting points. Right here, the desire of the individual is paramount. Here, social continuity. It is an alliance between communities that is actually it takes effect through the device of the individuals. Here, it is the individuals and their desire that is paramount. But I think the way in which the culture has accommodated both is where the arranged marriage has expanded. The meaning has expanded to include the desires of the individual. And so you have the arranged love marriage, in a sense, where you are arranged, you arrange for the couple to fall in love, in a sense, or the love arranged marriage, where the people have fallen in love and then you arrange the whole thing in any case. So that the sense that instead of thinking of them as polar opposites, and to me that is the biggest learning, and which is something that I'm anxious that does not change, is that instead of thinking of the world in terms of binaries and fundamentally different ideas presumed to be polar opposites, the attempt to always find a way where they become part of the same whole instead of there being two different opposites. I think that impulse of the culture is something that I find fascinating.
It's a culture that innately strives for synthesis and inclusion.
Yes.
It's a syncretic culture. So, as a closing thing, my invitation to you, Santosh, and I don't know if you want to even talk about it on this call, but taking this theme further, how would you explain the spate of rapes and what happened with the Nirbhaya case, and then
right.
Fatwa, and there was a time where, was it just that it was always happening, but it just got into media more, or is something going really off in the men of this country? What is it?
I think in a way, I think what we are seeing are two or three things. One is the fact that I think there is fundamentally, I think the kind of the roles that have been assigned to men and women, and the kind of hierarchical kind of positions that they have enjoyed, I think when they are fundamentally changing, and we do a lot of traveling across the country and a lot of work trying to figure this out, and you see that it's remarkable that you talk to young boys and young girls across the country today. Young men are diffident, young men are hesitant, they're tentative. Young women are confident, they are positive, they are bursting with ideas, and there is a great sense of optimism. But they also have begun, and typically women have always been careful to express their ambition in coded terms, because they understand, at an instinctive level, that too much you cannot wear it on your sleeve because that causes social dislocation. But increasingly, that is impossible now to hide the fact that women are see their roles differently, imagine themselves differently. And I think because this has been a fundamental pillar of what a lot of people think of as their values. A lot of what communities describe as their values is in fact nothing but the role that has been assigned to women in their scheme of things. And when that role fundamentally changes, there is anxiety, there is uncertainty, there is self-doubt. And so I think one strong element we are seeing is this stronger women, more tentative men, and more tentative men looking for ways to assert masculinity. So instead of, and because the pace of change is rapid, instead of having enough time for society to absorb this change, there is a sense of dislocation and disjuncture that is taking place. And this is what I think is creating great anxiety and a desire to sort of to express masculinity in more kind of primitive terms, in more aggressive terms. So I think that's one aspect that is happening. The other is, in a broad way, I think what we are, by legitimizing desire, and you know, I think people who have been in advertising in a sense, or in the idea of consumption and the idea of desire taking, you know, paramountcy. I mean, that it is, I think it also kind of legitimizes this, and there is an implicit pressure to, you know, and a sense that this is okay, that it is okay, and that if you desire something, you can have it. I mean, which is what actually the modern world tells us, in a sense, is that it's okay to desire things, and if you want something, and that is what, in a sense, technology is telling us. I mean, if you look at what implicitly technology tells us symbolically, something like a touch screen tells us that I want something, touch it. It'll happen. You know, I'm not trying to, you know, jump from here to saying that, you know, sexual assaults happen because of a touch screen. I mean, that would be absurd. But what I'm saying is that increasingly, this is a world that valorizes desire, and that it believes that in fact, that's what technology is doing, trying to, in many ways, reduce the gap between desire and its fulfillment. I mean, if you look at e-commerce, if you look at 10-minute delivery, if you look at, I mean, you look at the world, you know, from a larger perspective, fundamentally what we are trying to do today is to, you know, sort of minimize the gap between desire and its fulfillment. And the fact that fulfillment of desire is a right is implicitly what is a message that is being given, not in the sexual context, but generally. So I think when I take at one level this change in the relationship between, and the hierarchical position between men and women, the underlying sense that, you know, desire is legitimate, and, you know, and you know, it's perfectly okay. I think what you get is this a combination of a certain amount of impatience, a sense of being left out, a sense of, you know, trying to put women back into their place, and a sense of, you know, it's okay, you know, desire is okay. I think all of these work in concert, I think, to create what you are seeing, a much more aggressive kind of a reaction.
I think that was a very classic Santosh Desai response, you know, seeing both these trends and then putting them together. That's, yes, it just leaves us with more concern, actually, to close this call. And I just hope you will think it through and write another post on this, and we may have started a very important dialogue here.
Thanks, Nilima. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, me too. More to come.
Look forward. Okay.
Thank you.